Well, we're back finally for part 7 of the 4.7 liter HO 2002 Jeep Grand Cherokee motor rebuild series. We had a few issues. It's been a while. I'll kind of break it down for you a little bit. I think when I left you at the end of part 6, we had said that we were going to put the bed plate on and secure the crank, and we did just that. We used a silicone sealer that is recommended, and that job is done. So then we went about getting ready to put in the pistons, and I had some trouble with the pistons. On top of that, I had to go on a business trip, and so I was away for a few days, so it took a while to get back. Let me break down the situation on the pistons. Whenever we first began to install the pistons, the rings, which we covered earlier, were on. We set the ring gap location correctly, orientation correctly, and then we used an inexpensive ring compression tool. Again, as I said, I'm not a professional mechanic, so I don't necessarily have as high-end tools as many professional mechanics would have. So I was using actually a little rental ring compression. It's the band type, tall, thin metal band that you close with a 1/4-inch ratchet. And let me kind of break down what happens for you. I've got a different type here that I'm using now. Again, it's very inexpensive, and it has some real limitations. When you put this little guy, well, here's our piston we're fixing to install. This is 135. This is number 5. It's our 3rd piston to install on this reinstall. And what you do though is you slip this little guy over the piston and then clamp it down. And obviously we need to lift it out of here, but you want to clamp it such that the skirt is the bottom of the piston skirt is visible, and then you want to clamp it just so long as you're below the ring level. But what happens is, or what in my experience happened, is that as you tap the piston in, these little inexpensive ring compression tools will tend to go conical. They'll go narrow at the top, and they'll tend to widen out at the bottom because they're, I think, relatively inexpensive. And so what happened to us was whenever it would close at the top and open out at the bottom a little bit, the ring would get hung on the deck. And as we were tapping it in, we'd have to stop, reset, and try again. It was pretty much sheer luck sometimes when we got them in there. Well, one time I tapped it a little harder than I should and ended up breaking a ring. As you probably know, rings come in sets and they come without spares. So once you break a ring, you're either going to install a used ring or you're going to get some new rings. So I ended up having to get a new set of rings for this thing. So it took a while to get shipped in, and between that and my travels, it was real limiting. So what do we do to fix this? Maybe if I had been more cautious, well, certainly if I would have been more cautious, we'd have had less trouble. But caution's not what I want to rely on for a solution. So what I've done is I took one of the old pistons from before we rebuilt it, and I'm going to use it as a spacer. So if I install this piston into the top of this ring compression tool, it'll keep that ring compression tool from trying to go conical, close at the top, open at the bottom, exposing the rings to potential damage. So what I do is I pretty much just set my the depth of my ring compression tool, and I just stick in this other piston, old piston, and then I drop it in. And so now as I tap the piston down in, this will keep the space filled, keep it from going conical, and it taps in pretty smoothly with little force, which is what it should be. So we're going to go ahead and install this piston for you and let you see how we go about it, and including connecting the rod to the crank and those kind of things. So first I need to take the rod yoke off so that we're good to go. Right now I don't have any bearings installed. Recommend you not install the bearings until you get it in the block. They'll just fall out on you when you tap it, and then you got a potential damage taking place. Let me slide this one in this in number 7 here for a second. Because the next thing we need to do is take a little bit of oil. I got a little bucket of oil over here. A little bit of fresh motor oil, and then I just lube up the cylinder really good. This thing's gonna smoke pretty bad when fired up either way. So a little oil's just good for the soul when it comes to installing these pistons and getting them to slide down in there. Also, I didn't show it, but the piston itself, the outer skirt of the piston around the ring area, lubricate it pretty well before I put it into the ring compression tool, so that as I tap down, it wants to go. Also, make sure your orientation is correct. Here's the forward orientation on the rod, and I've covered the top of the piston now with this extra piston, but it also is, the forward mark is aligned there. So then I just take a little wood-handled hammer and as a bar, and then I use a standard hammer and just begin to tap it in. So it moves in steady and slow, which is what it should do. Now note this. You notice I did not put any kind of protection on the rod cap whenever I put it in there. If the rod cap were to impact the side of the piston, the side of the cylinder, then we could damage the cylinder. If it were to contact the journal bearing area on the crank, we should also tear up the crank. So what do? I make sure that the deck on the block is flat. So my rods will go straight down in, not contact the piston. And then I also make sure that the crank is turned such that, here, let me show you this. You can see here we drove it in just slightly below the end of this piston. So we're in there about 3/4 of an inch into the cylinder. So anyway, you want to be sure that you move the crank such that you clear the rod. You'll notice the crank is at its furthest position away from the cylinder, and therefore tapping it in like we did will not let us impact the crank. I always want to check these surfaces. I always like to make sure that they're good and smooth. I've not gotten anything on them, and we're good right here. Now let's talk a little bit about these rod bearings. Let me tell you, if you go by rod bearings, you're going to get one of two kinds for this motor. You're going to get the type that does not have a locating tab, orientation tab, and one that does. What I mean by that is the stock tabs. Let's see if I can get where you can see this. Excuse me. The stock bearings have this small tab right here. There's a matching tab in the rod, and also here in the rod yoke. There's actually, can you see it? 2 tabs. So if I put this tab and align it with this slot, excuse me, in the rod yoke, and we get very good centering of the rod bearing, and it just fixes it a bit better. Now, is the other type wrong? Apparently not. I've actually seen, went to a reach down here. Went to a major local auto parts house, asked to see a set of the rod bearings for this motor, which they happen to have, and sure enough, they did not have the locating notch on them, and so it is a acceptable replacement from what I can tell. I did a little bit of searching, couldn't find anything definitive, but it appears to be. So the next thing I'm going to do is, it's going to be kind of hard for you to see, and I'll apologize in advance. I'll show you down in the motor here as best I can. Here is the rod, the bottom of the rod, and here's where it's going to ride on the crank on this journal surface. So what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and install, get this thing set back right. We're going to go ahead and install the bearing for that rod, and we're going to put some assembly lubrication on that bearing surface. Again, assembly lube is great stuff. Intention of assembly lube is to keep you lubricated until you get good oil flow when you start the motor. So here's a little bit of assembly lube, which we're now going to rub onto this bearing surface. Sorry about this, you're not able to see too much, but you can just imagine assembly lube going onto a rod bearing. And now what we're going to do is we're going to pull or push, whichever or both, the piston through the cylinder until the rod bearing makes up with the crank surface. So you can now see here's one part of the rod bearing, the other side of it is, yoke is here, and then the other side of it's down there. Now, according to specification, we should have between, let me look and see, I think it's 4 and 19 10,000ths of an inch clearance on this rod bearing in order to get a properly lubricated rod bearing. So, like we did with the mains, we liked plastic gauge. Plastic gauge is quite the way to go. So we're going to cut us a piece of plastic gauge to length here. And we will open up plastic gauge paper and extract the actual thread of plastic gauge. Hopefully. There it is. And we're going to install it here on the rod surface. Sometimes it doesn't want to. Turn it a little bit so we can line our bolts better. Sometimes it doesn't always want to stay in place, but most of the time it does. So there's a small piece of plastic gauge there on the journal. So we're going to grab our journal yoke, figure out where I put it, and some tools. So now what we have to do is we have to go through the torque procedure. Let me show you something on the yoke real quick. The marker for orientation on the yoke that I use, at least, are these small, I think they're just forge marks, but there's two marks right here where the forge, or where when they cast it, rather, casting marks, when they cast it, that looks like a slag mark there. So anyway, that's toward the rear of the motor, that's the front of the motor. So we'll make sure our orientation is correct, and it is. Put the rod cap on and run it down. So I told you I would learn some things maybe painfully and you'd get to benefit from them, so I guess this whole ring issue was part of that. So the standard torque procedure for these bolts is 20 foot-pounds and 90 degrees. So there's our 20 foot-pounds. And we'll get our 90 degrees. I love my breaker bar for the 90 degrees. I'm probably going to lean all up in the camera when I do this, but what I do, and they actually have 90-degree markers. What I do is I just orient the breaker. I find 90 degrees, be this way, and then just take it to 90 degrees. Okay, so here's the second one. 90, we're here, so we need to go to here. Okay, so that bearing is, rod and bearing is installed and torqued. You'll notice I did not put any assembly lube on that bearing because of the fact that I was plastic gauging. I will assembly lube that bearing once I measure the bearing gap with the plastic gauge. So I like to leave it on for a couple seconds and then take it off. Give that plastic gauge time to conform correctly. So now the rod cap's coming off. Okay, rod cap is off, and we can take a look at our plastic gauge. I'm going to turn this for you a little bit. I'm going to hope we can get an orientation where you can see the plastic gauge mark. So the plastic gauge is here. I'm going to trust you can see it with all the reflections from the lights. But I check my plastic gauge, and it is as it's been in the other prior three. It's somewhere between 20 10,000s and 15 10,000s. So the upper specification is 19 10,000s. So if it's less than 20 10,000s, I'm confident that we're in a good place, and we are at or below 19 10,000s, but we are well above the 4 10,000s that's allowable. Don't think there's any issue that oil will dissolve the plastic gauge in time, but I like to just go ahead and try to rub the bulk of it off there. So what we're going to do now, we're going to grab our yoke pin. Here you can see, take a little bit of the assembly lube, and we're going to lubricate the inside of the yoke, nice and well lubricated. Then we're going to stick this on there again with our forward and reverse marks properly aligned, and then we're going to retighten these rod cap bolts. Forgive my vocabulary, I know I call them journals, I call them rod caps. The journal, I think, is actually the area of the crank where those bearings run. Rod cap or rod yoke in my mind is this part that we're bolting on now. So got those hand tightened. And we're going to set them to 20 foot-pounds of torque. And then we're going to give them 90 degrees here. Kind of interesting, you have to kind of put your body against the block, keep it from trying to run around on this engine stand. Okay, so there's our 90 degrees on each bolt. So that piston's installed. 1, 2, 3, 5 more to go. I'm going to go ahead and install these pistons. I'll get back with you. We'll talk a little bit about the side clearance on the pistons, and then we'll go from there. Thanks for watching.